The air in the Memphis Auditorium was practically crackling. It was more than just electricity. It was a living, breathing energy, woven from thousands of excited heartbeats and hushed whispers. Tonight, Elvis was in the building. Not just any Elvis, but the Elvis fresh off a string of sold-out shows, radiating that impossible charisma that had turned him into the king. Every seat was filled, a sea of eager faces, stretching back into the shadows of the upper balconies. Girls in their best dresses fidgeted with programs, their eyes wide with anticipation. Guys, in their clean-cut shirts, leaned forward, ready to witness a spectacle. The stage, bathed in a soft, expectant glow from the stage lights, stood empty for now, a velvet curtain hiding the magic that was about to unfold. Backstage, the scene was a controlled chaos. Roadies moved with practiced efficiency, checking microphone stands, adjusting amplifiers, and making sure every cable was coiled. Just so. The faint hum of the large sound system was a constant presence, a promise of the sonic boom to come. Elvis, in his dressing room, felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. He was tugging on his pristine white jumpsuit, the collar high, the intricate embroidery catching the light. His reflection stared back at him, the famous pompadour perfectly sculpted, the dark eyes holding a mix of concentration and thrill. 5 minutes. "Eee!" a voice called from outside his door. It was Joe Esposito, his loyal friend and road manager, his voice a little strained from the day's endless demands. Elvis nodded to himself, a small private ritual. Took a deep breath, letting the anticipation fill his lungs. This was his life, this connection with the crowd, this energy exchange that made him feel alive like nothing else. He loved the roar, the screams, the way the music moved through them all. He loved to give them a show, a memory they'd carry with them. He was about to walk out. The spotlight would hit him, and the auditorium would explode. It was the rhythm he lived by. He adjusted the belt of his jumpsuit, feeling the weight of the silver buckle. He was ready, more than ready. Could practically hear the collective held breath of the audience waiting. He imagined them fidgeting, whispering, their eyes fixed on the curtain. He pictured the way their faces would light up when he appeared. It was going to be another legendary night. Suddenly a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible dip in the lights. Then another murmurs began to ripple through the audience like a wave. Backstage, a few crew members exchanged quick, concerned glances. The hum of the sound system wavered. Before anyone could react, before the murmurs could turn into questions, a deafening crack ripped through the air. It wasn't the sound of thunder. It was the sound of something vital, breaking. Something electric and powerful. And then, silence. Absolute, profound silence. The stage lights died. The house lights vanished. The giant spotlights that usually cut through the darkness, painting the stage with vibrant colors, went out, leaving behind only ghostly afterimages in the mind's eye. The auditorium was plunged into instant, total darkness. For a moment there was a collective gasp from the thousands of people. Then a beat of stunned quiet. And then a ripple of nervous giggles, quickly replaced by a growing hum of confusion, then outright chatter. Flashlights from ushers' belts flickered on, cutting weak, wavering beams through the blackness. Cell phone screens, small islands of light, popped up throughout the crowd, illuminating anxious faces backstage. The panic was immediate and palpable. Joe Esposito burst into Elvis's dressing room, his face pale in the faint emergency lighting that had just kicked in, casting long, distorted shadows. "Elvis, the power's out, completely out." Elvis stood frozen for a second, the grandeur of his jumpsuit feeling suddenly out of place in the sudden gloom. The roar of the crowd, the sound of his music, the very energy he thrived on, all gone. Replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by the increasing murmur of thousands of disappointed voices. He could hear them now, a rising tide of confusion and frustration. This wasn't just a flicker. This was a total blackout. The show, the grand electrifying spectacle he was about to deliver, was suddenly in jeopardy. The thought sent a jolt through him, sharper than any stage fright. He had never experienced anything like this. Not during a show, not with this many people, not when the moment was so utterly poised for magic. He stepped out of the dressing room, the emergency lights making everything look eerie and unfamiliar. Crew members were shouting into crackling walkie-talkies. "No power from the grid. It's a city-wide outage," someone yelled. Another voice, higher pitched. "Generator's not kicking in. We've got nothing." The energy in the auditorium was changing. The initial confusion was morphing into something more restless, more agitated. People had paid good money, traveled from miles around to see him, and now this... He felt a pang of disappointment, not just for himself, but for every single person out there in the dark, waiting. Joe was beside him, running a hand through his hair. Colonel's on the phone trying to figure something out, but it looks bad, really bad. Elvis walked to the edge of the backstage area, peering through a small gap in the curtain. All he could see was the vast, inky blackness of the auditorium, punctuated by the tiny bobbing lights of cell phones and flashlights. The murmuring was turning into a low rumble. Could feel the collective frustration, the potential for anger. He knew what a crowd could be like when disappointed. He had to do something, but what? The music was his language, and suddenly the means to speak it had been ripped away. The thought was terrifying. He was the king. But without his castle lights, without his voice amplified, he was just a man in a fancy suit in the dark. And that, he realized, was unacceptable. The air in the backstage area was thick with tension, a suffocating blanket of panic and frustration. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, was a hurricane of stressed energy. His face flushed, his voice booming into the dead phone. "What do you mean, indefinite? This is Elvis Presley. People don't wait indefinitely," he roared, slamming the receiver down. The phone, of course, was also dead, just another victim of the widespread blackout. "No good, Elvis," Joe Esposito said, his voice unusually quiet, defeat etched on his face. "The entire district is out. They don't know when it'll be back. The emergency generator for the stage power. It's just not firing up. Looks like we have to call it." Collective groan went through the crew. Members gathered around, all looking equally disheartened. Calling off an Elvis show was almost unthinkable. It had happened maybe once or twice in his entire career, and always for something truly unavoidable, like a sudden illness. Not for a blackout. Not when thousands of fans were still out there holding on to hope. From beyond the curtain, the murmuring of the crowd had grown louder, more anxious. A few isolated shouts could now be heard. "We want Elvis," someone yelled, their voice echoing strangely in the unpowered hall. Then another, "Turn the lights on." It was the sound of a crowd on the edge, their patience fraying. Elvis stood perfectly still, listening. He could feel their disappointment, their yearning. It resonated deep within him. He thought of all the faces he'd seen filing into the auditorium, the excitement on their features. He couldn't just leave them like this. Not after they had come all this way, not when their hopes were so high. "No," Elvis said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the general despair. "We're not calling it." Joe looked at him bewildered. "Elvis, what are you talking about? There's no power, no lights, no sound system, no instruments. What are we going to do? Sing a cappella in the dark?" He meant it as a rhetorical, almost sarcastic question, highlighting the absurdity of the situation, but Elvis's eyes gleamed with a sudden, unexpected spark. An idea wild and impossible began to form in his mind. He was remembering something his mother had told him once, back when they were dirt poor, living in a one-room shack in Tubala. "When the lights go out, son, that's when you really see who's got the light inside." He wasn't sure why that memory surfaced now, but it did, strong and clear. "We need a light," Elvis said, looking around the darkened backstage area. "A real light, not just these little flashlights." Joe looked around helplessly. "What kind of light?" "We don't have emergency stage lights that run on batteries." "Something simple. Elver props, instrument cases, everything. Something like a candle." A flicker of recognition crossed Joe's face. A candle, like a real wax candle. He looked doubtfully at Elvis. Just then, a young stagehand, barely more than a kid, elbowed his way through the small crowd of crew members. He was holding something small and white in his hand. "Mr. Esposito, I found this. It was on the prop table for the banquet scene in Speedway. I think Colonel Parker told me to put it away." In his hand was a single, thick, white pillar candle. It wasn't fancy, just a plain utilitarian candle. Perhaps 6 inches tall, but in that moment, it seemed like a beacon. Elvis reached out and took it, his fingers closing around the cool wax. It felt surprisingly solid, substantial. He held it up, and in the dim emergency light, it looked almost comical. A tiny piece of hope against overwhelming darkness. "There," Elvis said, his voice gaining strength. Colonel Parker, who had been listening with a mixture of disbelief and growing horror, stepped forward. "Elvis, what in the good Lord's name are you thinking? You can't go out there with a candle. This isn't some campfire. Sing along. This is an Elvis Presley concert. We need lights, sound effects, the whole enchilada." "The whole enchilada isn't happening," Colonel Elvis retorted, his eyes flashing. "But they came to see me. They paid to hear me sing, and I'm going to sing for them." The band members, who had been quietly standing by looking shell-shocked, exchanged uncertain glances. Scotty Moore, his lead guitarist, stepped forward. "Elvis, with all due respect, what are we going to play? No amps, no mics. It'll just be a whisper in this hall." "Then I'll whisper," Elvis said, a new resolve, hardening his features. "But I'll be out there, and I'll sing, and they'll hear me. We don't need all the fancy stuff tonight, we just need to connect." He looked at the candle in his hand, then back at his crew, his friends. His gaze was steady, unwavering. "They want a show, I'll give them a show. Not the one they expected maybe, but one they'll never forget." A hush fell over the backstage area. The absurdity of it was still there, but now, mixed with a strange kind of awe, King, stripped of his spectacle, reduced to a single candle. It was madness, it was impossible, but it was also, undeniably. After a long moment, slowly nodded. He knew Elvis. When that look was in his eyes, there was no stopping him. Another stagehand, quick thinking, pulled a Zippo lighter from his pocket. Tiny flame flickered to life, offering a brief, almost sacred glow. Elvis leaned the candle towards it, and with a soft pop, a small golden flame bloomed atop the white wax. The little flame danced, casting a warm, living light on Elvis's face. His eyes, usually shadowed by the brim of his hat or the glare of spotlights, now seemed to hold all the light in the room. In that single flickering light, he no longer looked like a superstar in an ornate jumpsuit. He looked like a man with a purpose, with a quiet strength that transcended the chaos. He looked like the true heart of the music, ready to share it, no matter the circumstances. The glimmer of hope was no longer just a thought. It was a tiny, dancing flame ready to light the way. The small flame of the candle seemed to cast giant dancing shadows on the walls of the back corridor. Elvis held it carefully, shielding it with his hand as if it were the most precious thing in the world. And in that moment, for him it represented a possibility, a defiance against the overwhelming darkness and the crushing disappointment that threatened to engulf the Memphis Auditorium. Colonel Parker was still sputtering, pacing a tight circle in the limited space. "This is professional suicide, Elvis. What will the papers say? Elvis sings by candlelight. It sounds like a joke. Will be the laughingstock of the industry." Elvis didn't take his eyes off the candle. "They'll say I gave them a show, Colonel. That's what they'll say." He turned to his band. "Scotty, DJ Bill, what do you say? Are you with me?" Scotty Moore, his usually stoic lead guitarist, looked from Elvis to the candle, then out towards the curtain. He imagined the vast silent hall and the utter impossibility of playing without power. "Elvis, we can't even plug in our instruments. No drums for DJ, no bass for Bill. My guitar's just a piece of wood without the amp." "I know," Elvis said, his voice calm, resonating with an unshakable conviction. "But your voices still work. My voice still works. We'll do it a cappella, or just with whatever acoustic sound we can get." DJ Fontana, the drummer, rubbed his chin. "No drums. E. That's a whole different kind of show. It's the only kind of show we can give tonight," Elvis replied. He knew it was a colossal risk. His shows were famous for their energy, the driving beat, the electrifying guitar solos. Stripped down raw, without any amplification, it was a gamble of epic proportions. It could fall flat, be an embarrassment, but the alternative, simply sending everyone home, felt like a betrayal. He remembered the faces of the fans, the young girl with tears in her eyes who'd pressed a crumpled drawing into his hand at a meet and greet last week, the elderly couple who had saved for months to buy tickets, their faces shining with pure joy. These weren't just anonymous faces in a crowd. They were individuals, each with a story, each carrying a hope for a magical night. He owed it to them. "Think about it," Elvis continued, looking from one band member to the next, his voice quiet but persuasive. "This isn't about the lights or the sound system. It's about the music. It's about us together. In this moment, it's about showing them that even when everything else fails, the music still stands." Bill Black, the bassist, a man of few words, shifted his weight. "It's never been done, E." "That's how legends are made, Bill," Elvis said, a hint of his famous grin touching his lips, softened by the candlelight. "By doing what's never been done." He looked out toward the curtain again, listening to the growing restlessness of the crowd. The shouts were more frequent now, tinged with impatience. Is he coming out or not? Refunds, a deep breath. This was it, the moment of decision. He could choose to play it safe, cancel the show, issue refunds, and manage the bad press, or he could walk out into that vast, dark auditorium armed with nothing but his voice, his talent, and a single flickering flame, and trust that the connection with his audience was stronger than any electrical current. His mind flashed back to his early days, playing small juke joints, no fancy equipment. Just him and his guitar, pouring his soul out. It was different, of course, 1,000 times bigger, but the core desire was the same: to sing, to connect, to move people. "I'm going out," Elvis declared. His decision made, there was no wavering, no doubt left in his voice. It was simply a fact. "With or without you guys, but I'd sure appreciate it if you came along." Scotty looked at DJ, then at Bill. They exchanged a silent conversation. A lifetime of shared stages and shared music passing between them. They knew Elvis. They knew his heart. And they knew that when he was like this, he was unstoppable. And truthfully, a part of them, the part that lived for the music, was intrigued by the sheer audacity of it. "All right, here, Scotty," finally said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Let's make some history." DJ nodded. "I'll clap a beat if I have to." Bill just gave a curt nod, a sign of his agreement. A sense of relief washed over Elvis, quickly replaced by a surge of excitement. They were with him, his boys, his music family. Colonel Parker threw his hands up in exasperation, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. A grudging admiration, perhaps, or a calculated recognition of the sheer publicity value if this crazy stunt actually worked. "You're insane, Presley, utterly insane. But if you insist on making a fool of yourself, at least let Joe walk you out. And for heaven's sake, don't drop that blessed candle." "Elvis, dream of it, Colonel." He turned to Joe. "Just lead me to the center, Joe, and make sure the stage is clear. No tripping hazards in the dark." Joe, a look of awe on his face, nodded silently. He knew he was about to witness something extraordinary. Carefully opened the heavy velvet curtain just enough for Elvis to slip through. The sounds of the restless crowd immediately amplified, closer now. Elvis took another deep breath. the scent of dust and old velvet filling his nostrils. Candlelight in his hand offered only a small circle of illumination, barely reaching his feet. Beyond that, it was a vast, formless black. He took a single step forward, then another. The murmurs of the crowd grew, then began to die down, replaced by a strange, anticipatory silence. They were sensing something different, something they hadn't expected. King was about to enter his unlit domain, and the legend was about to truly begin. The heavy velvet curtain parted just a crack, letting Elvis slip through. Joe Esposito, a flashlight beam dancing nervously around their feet, guided him onto the stage. The stage, usually a riot of light and color, was now a cavernous, inky blackness. Even the shapes of the instruments, the microphone stand, were swallowed by the gloom. It was disorienting, unsettling. Elvis took a breath, holding the candle carefully. The small golden flame flickered, casting a dancing circle of light around him. It lit up a small section of the stage floor, a tiny island in a sea of darkness. His white jumpsuit, designed for blinding spotlights, now seemed to absorb the scant light, making him a ghostly figure emerging from the void. He took a few slow steps towards what he knew was the center of the stage, the usual spot where he began every show. The silence from the audience was absolute, now a thick, palpable blanket. The restless chatter had died, replaced by an eerie, stunned quiet. Thousands of eyes, accustomed to dazzling lights and a grand entrance, were straining to make sense of what they were seeing, or rather, not seeing. As he reached the center, he held the candle higher. The small flame bobbed gently, illuminating his face. Just his face, like a portrait appearing out of nowhere. His eyes, dark and intense, seemed to pierce the darkness, reaching out to the unseen faces in the auditorium. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. It wasn't a gasp of disappointment or even of recognition. It was a sound of sheer, unadulterated surprise. They could see him now, just barely a single glowing point of light in the vast darkness. He was there, the king was on stage, and he was holding a candle. A few whispers broke the silence, like distant ripples on a still pond. "Is that Elvis? He's got a candle. What's going on?" Elvis stood completely still for a moment, letting the silence and the unusual tableau sink in. He could feel the weight of their gaze, even though he couldn't see their faces. He knew this was unprecedented. He knew this was bizarre. But he also knew deep down that it was powerfully intimate. He took another breath. Then slowly, deliberately, he lifted his free hand and tapped the unpowered microphone. Clink of his ring against the metal echoed strangely in the silent hall, a stark reminder that there was no amplification. He lowered the candle slightly, so its light fell on his mouth. His voice, unamplified, cut through the quiet. It wasn't the roaring, powerful voice they were used to. It was softer, more personal, yet it carried an incredible presence. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice surprisingly clear, though it took a moment for the thousands in the back to truly register it. "As you can probably tell, we've had a bit of a situation tonight." A few nervous titters from the audience, a nervous cough. The faint flicker of cell phone screens still dotted the darkness like distant stars. "The power, it seems, has decided to take a vacation," Elvis continued, a touch of dry humor in his tone. "And it looks like our usual show with all the bells and whistles isn't going to happen tonight." A wave of disappointed murmurs began to rise again. He had to act fast. A new kind of silence settled, one of curiosity, of wonder. What was he going to do? Elvis slowly raised the candle higher again, letting its soft glow illuminate his famous face, the slight smile playing on his lips. "It might be a little different," he admitted, his voice a warm, inviting tone. "A lot different. Actually, we won't have the lights or the big sound. My band, bless their hearts, are back there." He paused and a few chuckles rippled through the crowd. He had them listening. "But we do have this," he said, holding up the candle. The small flame danced, a tiny beacon of defiance against the overwhelming darkness. "And we have our voices." He looked out into the unseen crowd, letting his gaze sweep over the vast dark space. "So if you'll bear with me," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming even more intimate, "I thought perhaps we could just sing a little. a breath held by thousands. Then, from somewhere in the front rose a single tentative clap, then another, and then, like a spark-catching tinder, a wave of applause, hesitant at first, then growing in strength, filling the auditorium with a sound that was raw and genuine, unlike the usual roaring ovation. It was applause born of surprise, of respect, and of a shared incredible moment. Elvis let the applause wash over him, his heart swelling. He hadn't given them the spectacle, but he had given them something else. A promise, an invitation, a shared experience in the face of the unexpected. He looked down at the candle, its flame steady now, and knew he had made the right decision. This wasn't just a show anymore. This was something truly legendary. The applause died down, replaced by a reverent hush. Every eye, or at least every straining gaze, was fixed on the lone figure at the center of the stage, illuminated by a single, flickering candle. The silence in the Memphis Auditorium was profound, broken only by the occasional cough or the rustle of clothing. It was a silence filled with anticipation, with a kind of communal breath-holding. Elvis stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, yet also exhilarating him. This was it. No backing tracks, no thunderous drums, no searing guitar solos. Just him, his voice, and the fragile glow of the candle. Closed his eyes for a split second, letting the enormity of the situation sink in. He thought of his mother, of the hymns they sang together in church, of the pure, unadorned power of the human voice. He opened his eyes, fixed his gaze on a point somewhere in the middle distance, and without any introduction, he began to sing. The first notes were soft, almost a whisper, yet perfectly clear, carrying through the immense hall in a way that defied logic. Wise men say only fools rush in. It was "Can't Help Falling in Love," a ballad known by heart by millions, chosen for its gentle melody, its simple beauty, and its profound emotional resonance. In the vast darkness, with only the candlelight illuminating his face, his voice seemed to possess a new, almost ethereal quality. Each word was carefully articulated, each note pure and true without the usual reverb or effects. It was just the raw power of Elvis Presley's voice, unfiltered and unadorned. The effect on the audience was instantaneous and breathtaking. A collective sigh seemed to ripple through the crowd. Some people leaned forward in their seats, straining to catch every nuance. Others simply sat back transfixed, tears silently tracing paths down their cheeks in the darkness. The single candle held steady in Elvis's hand seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his singing, its flame dancing in time with the emotional power he was pouring into the song. His voice, usually capable of filling stadiums with explosive sound, now filled the auditorium with an intimate warmth. It was as if he was singing directly to each person, individually confiding the words, sharing a secret. The lack of amplification stripped away the spectacle, leaving only the pure artistry, the sheer, undeniable talent that lay at the heart of his fame. As he reached the chorus, "But I can't help falling in love with you," a few hesitant voices from the audience joined in humming the melody or softly singing along. It wasn't loud, just a quiet, almost unconscious participation, a testament to the song's ubiquity and the shared emotion in the room. Continued, his eyes closed for parts of it, lost in the feeling, letting the melody guide him. He moved slightly, a gentle sway, a subtle tilt of his head, even without the full body gyrations he was famous for. The candlelight moved with him, creating fluid shadows on the stage floor. It was a performance, stripped bare, vulnerable, yet profoundly powerful. The air in the auditorium seemed to thicken, charged not with electricity but with pure emotion. It was a shared moment, a collective breath, a recognition that they were witnessing something truly unique, something that might never happen again. This wasn't a concert, it was an experience. It was a spiritual gathering illuminated by a single fragile flame. When he finished the song, the last note fading into the darkness, the silence that followed was even more profound than before. It wasn't a stunned silence now, but a silence of reverence, of awe. No one dared to break it immediately, as if applause would shatter the delicate magic that had been woven then. From the front, a woman began to sob quietly, and then from another section a man cleared his throat, deeply moved. Finally, a slow-building wave of applause began, different from any he had heard before. It wasn't the roaring, screaming adulation he usually received. It was softer, deeper, infused with gratitude and a powerful sense of shared experience. It was the sound of thousands of people recognizing a moment of pure, unadulterated artistry. Elvis opened his eyes. In the darkness beyond the candle's glow, he could just make out tiny pinpricks of light now appearing throughout the audience. Not just cell phones, but small match flames, lighters flickering to life, held up by hands. They were lighting their own candles, their own small beacons, in a spontaneous gesture of unity and connection. The vast, dark auditorium was slowly, beautifully becoming a constellation of tiny, dancing lights, all shining for him, all part of this incredible, unplanned miracle. He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. This was more than he could have ever hoped for. This was legendary. The sight of the tiny flames appearing throughout the auditorium brought a lump to Elvis's throat. It was a spontaneous response, an unspoken conversation between him and his audience. A shared understanding of the moment. Each flickering light was a silent thank you, a declaration of solidarity, a connection stronger than any amplifier or light rig could forge. He waited, letting the soft glow from the multitude of lighters and matches fill the space. The air now held a faint, sweet smell of burnt matchsticks, mingling with the subtle perfume of the crowd. It was beautiful, truly beautiful. "Thank you," Elvis said, his voice a little huskier now, filled with genuine emotion. "Thank you all so much for staying, for being here with me tonight." His gaze swept over the twinkling lights, a vast, living tapestry of warmth. This is more special than any show we could have planned." A wave of soft murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. He could hear some sniffles, quiet, emotional releases. People were visibly touched. "You know," Elvis continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone, intimate and direct, as if he were talking to a few close friends in a living room. "When I first started out, playing little clubs, little juke joints, in Memphis, we didn't have fancy lights or huge sound systems. Sometimes we barely had a working microphone." He chuckled softly, and a few people in the crowd chuckled with him. "It was just me, Scotty Bill DJ, sometimes, and a few folks gathered round, just listening to the music." Paused, letting the memory hang in the air, connecting it to the present moment. "And you know what those were? Some of the most honest, most real shows, because it was just the music, just the feeling." He looked around, gesturing vaguely at the darkness surrounding them, then down at the candle in his hand. "And in a strange way, tonight feels a little like that. Like we're all just gathered here, sharing something special, stripped down to what really matters." He leaned closer to the unpowered microphone stand, as if it still held some magic, though he knew it didn't. It was more for habit, a familiar anchor. "I know some of you came from far away. Some of you have waited a long time to see a show, and I didn't want to send you home disappointed." He paused. "My mama always taught me, son, when you promise something, you keep it, no matter what." A wave of ahs and sympathetic murmurs from the audience. The connection deepened. He wasn't just Elvis the superstar anymore. He was Elvis, a human being, sharing a piece of his heart and his humble beginnings. "So," he said, drawing another breath, "since we're all here, and since you've lit up this room for me so beautifully," he gestured to the scattered lights, "how about we sing another one? This one's always been close to my heart." And then, softly, he began to sing "Love Me Tender." The melody, a gentle lullaby, filled the quiet hall. His voice once again was pure and unadulterated, holding every ounce of emotion. This song, even more than the last, invited participation, and this time it was louder, more confident. The hums began first, then a few voices, then more and more, until a soft, harmonious wave of singing flowed from the audience, mingling with Elvis's voice. It wasn't a perfect choir. Some were off-key, some were a little too loud, some just hummed along, but it was genuine, heartfelt, and powerful. Collective sound of thousands of voices, unamplified, creating their own music in the darkness, was truly awe-inspiring. Elvis, holding his candle, swayed gently, his eyes scanning the constellations of lights, a genuine, joyful smile on his face. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. It was a unique, unforgettable moment of shared vulnerability and beauty. It wasn't just a concert. It was a communion. He was not just singing to them. They were singing with him, part of the same magical, impromptu performance. The little candle in his hand, now almost half burned, seemed to glow even brighter. A silent testament to the warmth and light that had filled the darkest auditorium in Memphis. The connection was undeniable, palpable, and profoundly moving. The last notes of "Love Me Tender," sung by thousands of voices alongside Elvis, faded into the profound silence of the unlit auditorium. The air was thick with emotion, a tangible wave of shared feeling. Tiny lights held by the audience flickered, a silent testament to the intimate bond that had formed between the king and his loyal subjects. Elvis, still holding his candle, took a moment to simply breathe it all in. He could hear the quiet sniffles, the appreciative murmurs. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, an almost overwhelming warmth spreading through his chest. This was beyond any roaring applause or dazzling light show. This was raw, authentic connection. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice resonating through the hushed hall. "That was beautiful, truly beautiful." He adjusted his grip on the candle, which was now noticeably shorter, its wax melting down the sides. "You know," he continued, his voice a little more relaxed, more conversational now, "there are times in life when you realize what truly matters. When all the fancy stuff gets stripped away, you see what's left, and it's faith." Paused, a thoughtful expression on his face, illuminated by the flickering light. Growing up, music was always a comfort, and some of the most comforting songs for me were the gospel songs. The ones that spoke to the soul, that reminded you there was always light, even in the darkest times. A few murmurs of agreement rose from the audience. Many of them shared his southern roots, his upbringing in the church. "So, if you'll indulge me," he said, a gentle smile touching his lips, "I'd like to share one of those with you, just pure and simple for all of us." And then he began to sing "Amazing Grace." His voice, usually powerful and vibrant in his rock and roll numbers, now held a deep, resonant quality, filled with a spiritual sincerity that was almost overwhelming. Each word was imbued with meaning, each note a prayer. The familiar melody, stripped of all instrumentation, was breathtaking in its simplicity. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. This wasn't a performance anymore, it was an act of worship, a shared moment of reflection and hope. People bowed their heads, some closed their eyes, letting the timeless words in Elvis's incredible voice wash over them. The tiny lights in the audience seemed to dim slightly in reverence, their owners completely absorbed. This was Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, singing a gospel hymn, completely acoustic, in a pitch-black auditorium, lit only by a single candle held in his own hand. It was an image that would forever be etched in the minds of everyone present. It transcended genre, transcended fame, transcended the very idea of a concert. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated human connection. Through music, as he reached the final verse, his voice rose, not in volume, but in intensity, filling the space with a quiet, soaring power. "Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. "'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." When the last note faded, the silence was even more profound than before. It was a sacred silence filled with a sense of peace and wonder. No applause erupted immediately. It was as if no one wanted to break the spell. Tears flowed freely now, not just from women, but from hardened men, from teenagers, from everyone whose heart had been touched by the raw emotion of the performance. Then, slowly, hesitantly, a few people started to hum the melody. Others joined in a quiet, mournful, yet incredibly beautiful chorus, rising from the depths of the auditorium. It was a spontaneous communal response, a shared echo of the powerful moment. Elvis, his eyes glistening in the candlelight, simply stood there, letting the hum of the audience wash over him. He felt utterly exposed, yet completely connected. This was the moment where the legend of Elvis Presley the showman intertwined with the soul of Elvis Presley, the human being, illuminated by a single unwavering flame. It was spontaneous magic born from darkness, and it was unforgettable. The lingering hum of Amazing Grace slowly faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier, more profound than before. The atmosphere in the auditorium was thick with emotion, a mix of awe, gratitude, and a shared sense of something truly sacred having just occurred. The tiny constellation of lights from the audience flickered, their owners lost in thought, still wrapped in the magic Elvis had created with just his voice and a candle. Elvis stood at the center of the stage, the remaining stub of the candle now quite short, its flame still steady. He felt an exhaustion, but it was a good exhaustion, the kind that comes from pouring every ounce of your being into something truly meaningful. He didn't know how long he had been singing, but it felt like time had ceased to exist. He was just about to say something, perhaps thank them again, when a sudden low rumble vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the sound of the main power grid returning, not yet, but something else. A mechanical groan, then a cough, and then a steady, rhythmic thrumming began to echo through the building. The audience stirred, a collective murmur rising. What was that? Is it back on? Suddenly, with a soft click and a whir, a single powerful beam of light sliced through the darkness. It was a spotlight, just one originating from the control booth at the back of the auditorium, powered by a newly activated emergency generator. The beam wasn't full concert strength, but it was bright enough to cut through the gloom, hitting Elvis precisely where he stood. The effect was jarring. After minutes, perhaps an hour, of near total darkness, the sudden burst of light was almost blinding. The audience gasped, a mix of relief and surprise. The faces of the people in the first few rows were now visible, illuminated by the bright beam. Expressions of astonishment, tears still on some cheeks, smiles of wonder on others. The tiny lights of the lighters and cell phones in the audience, which had seemed so vibrant moments before, now appeared faint and insignificant against the new artificial brightness of the spotlight. The shared intimacy of the candlelit darkness was instantly altered. Elvis blinked, adjusting his eyes to the sudden glare. He could now clearly see the thousands of faces stretching out before him, a sea of expressions reflecting the sudden change. He saw Joe Esposito and Colonel Parker peeking from behind the curtain, their faces a mixture of relief and bewildered triumph. The thrumming of the generator continued steady and strong. It meant he could use the microphone. He could have a proper show again, at least partially. The spectacle, the power was returning, but something in him resisted. The magic they had just shared, forged in the darkness and silence, felt too precious to simply abandon for the sake of renewed technology. He had created something pure and unforgettable. He didn't want to lose that. He looked down at the candle in his hand, its flame still bravely burning despite the new, brighter light. It was small, humble, but it represented everything that had just happened. The raw connection, the vulnerability, the shared humanity. He made a decision, instinctively. He slowly, deliberately brought the candle closer to his face, so that the spotlight now illuminating him also caught the flickering flame. He raised the microphone, which was now thankfully powered, but he kept it close to his mouth, almost as if he was still whispering. "Well, folks," he said, his voice now amplified, rich and powerful, but still holding the intimate tone he had adopted in the darkness. "Looks like we've got a little bit of juice back, just enough to help me reach all of you." He paused, looking directly into the spotlight, then out at the audience, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "But you know what?" he continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more heartfelt. "That candle, it got us through. It helped us find each other in the dark, and I think tonight it deserves its own spot." Carefully placed the candle on the edge of the stage directly in the spotlight's glow, so its small, unwavering flame was visible to everyone. It was a silent acknowledgement, a tribute to the improbable journey they had all just taken together. The audience, sensing his intent, cheered. It wasn't a wild, ecstatic cheer for the return of power, but a deep, appreciative roar for his choice, for his respect for the moment they had shared. They understood. They were part of something unique. They had witnessed the king stripped of his crown, yet reigning more powerfully than ever before. The stage was still largely dark, the band instruments still silent, but the central solitary spotlight combined with a brave little candle created a new kind of powerful image. The show, reborn from the ashes of the blackout, was about to continue, but forever changed. With the single spotlight illuminating him and the humble candle flickering beside him, Elvis took a moment to absorb the renewed energy of the crowd. The applause, though different from his usual bombastic welcome, was charged with a deeper appreciation. The generator hummed softly in the background, a new comforting presence. "All right," Elvis said, his amplified voice filling the hall, warm and resonant. "It feels good to have you all a little closer now." He gestured towards the audience. "Visible once more in the spotlight spill, my voice can reach you without me having to yell." A chuckle rippled through the crowd. "My band," he called out, looking towards the dark recesses where his musicians stood. "Scotty, DJ Bill, you guys want to try and join me on something? Something we can do without all the electricity? Just pure and simple." From the wings, Scotty Moore emerged, carrying his acoustic guitar. He hadn't bothered with the electric. The amplifiers were still dead. DJ Fontana came out with a pair of drumsticks, and Bill Black, ever pragmatic, had found a single upright bass, its deep, resonant body promising sound without electricity. They positioned themselves in the pool of light, still looking a little surreal in the half-darkness of the stage. "All right, boys," Elvis said, a genuine smile on his face. "Let's give these good people something they can really feel." He began to hum the opening notes of Heartbreak Hotel. The audience gasped with delight. This was one of his most iconic songs, usually delivered with a driving rhythm and a wailing electric guitar, but tonight it would be different. Scotty began to pluck the bluesy melody on his acoustic, raw and unadorned. DJ tapped out a subtle rhythmic beat on his knee with his sticks, a percussive whisper that somehow filled the hall. Bill's fingers danced on the strings of the upright bass, providing a deep, soulful foundation. Elvis began to sing, his voice rich and full, amplified now, yet still retaining the intimacy of the earlier candlelit performance. The famous lyrics, usually delivered with a swagger, now carried a profound melancholic depth. "Well, since my baby left me, I've found a new place to dwell. It's down at the end of Lonely Street, at Heartbreak Hotel." The audience swayed, captivated. They weren't dancing or screaming like they normally would. This was a deeper engagement, a collective surrender to the raw artistry unfolding before them. They heard the nuances in Scotty's acoustic guitar, the subtle, almost spiritual beat DJ provided, the mournful groan of Bill's bass, and Elvis, standing there in the single spotlight, the small candle still burning brightly beside him, poured every ounce of his soul into the song. He still moved, of course, the famous Elvis sway, the subtle hip movements, but it was softer, more fluid, less about spectacle and more about feeling. The music in his bones, the white jumpsuit, no longer gleaming under multiple lights, seemed to absorb the single spotlight, making him a more defined, almost sculptural presence. When Heartbreak Hotel ended, the applause was thunderous. It was a roar of appreciation, of awe, of genuine love for an artist who had stripped away all the pretense and given them something real. Thank you very much," Elvis said, humbled by their reaction. He took a sip of water that Joe had quietly placed near him. The band members looked at each other, grinning clearly, enjoying this unprecedented performance. "You know, tonight has been something else," Elvis said, his voice thoughtful. "It reminds me why I do this. Not for the fame, not for the money, but for the connection. For moments like this, where it's just us and the music," he pointed to the audience. "You all are the best fans in the world. You truly are." Another wave of heartfelt applause erupted. "I think we've got time for one more," Elvis said, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Something to send you home with. Something to remind you that even in the dark there's always a little less conversation and a little more action." A huge cheer went up as Scotty launched into the familiar, catchy riff of "A Little Less Conversation." This time, Elvis let loose a little grooving more freely, his energy contagious even with the limited instrumentation. DJ smacked his knees and clapped his hands, and Dill's bass provided a surprisingly funky beat. The audience clapped along, many singing the lyrics at the top of their lungs, their voices mingling with Elvis's amplified one, creating a powerful, spontaneous choir. It was an energetic, joyous ending to a night that had begun in chaos. When the last note rang out, Elvis bowed, genuinely moved. The applause was deafening, a roaring crescendo of love and appreciation. He blew kisses, waved, and then, with one last look at the brave little candle still burning on the stage, he gave a final, deep bow. "Thank you. God bless you all. Good night." He walked off stage, the single spotlight following him, leaving behind the dark auditorium filled with the echo of applause and the thrumming of the generator. He had come out in darkness with a single candle, and he had left them with a legendary memory. As Elvis stepped off the stage, the single spotlight beam fading behind him, the power in the Memphis Auditorium suddenly surged back to life. With a loud whump, the main stage lights blazed on, the house lights flooded the hall, and the full sound system hummed back to life with a low growl. The sudden return to full illumination was almost blinding after the extended period of darkness and partial light. The remaining audience members, still on their feet, roared their approval, though many were still wiping tears from their eyes. They hadn't just seen a concert. They had witnessed history. Backstage, the scene was a mix of chaos and triumph. Colonel Pucker, usually unflappable, rushed forward, his face red with a combination of relief and pride. "Elvis, you crazy, magnificent fool. You did it. You actually did it." Clapped Elvis on the back, a rare display of genuine emotion from the shrewd manager. Joe Esposito was already there, handing Elvis a towel and a glass of water. "That was incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Never." Elvis took a long drink, feeling the coolness of the water against his throat. He was exhausted but exhilarated. His jumpsuit, usually pristine, had a faint smudge of wax on the thigh from where he'd held the candle. He looked back towards the stage. The single candle which he had left burning at the edge looked almost comical now amidst the dazzling array of stage lights, its tiny flame still flickering defiantly. "They deserved it," Elvis said, elation. The next morning the story was everywhere. Not just in Memphis, but across the nation and quickly the world. Elvis sings by candlelight, a legendary night. The King's raw talent shines in darkness. Power outage becomes Presley's finest hour. The headlines screamed, accompanied by blurry, incredible photos taken by audience members on their primitive cell phones or small cameras showing a single illuminated figure against a backdrop. The media coverage wasn't just about the spectacle. It was about the spirit. Journalists hailed his courage, his humility, his unwavering dedication to his fans. Critics, often quick to dismiss him as merely a showman, were forced to acknowledge the raw, unamplified power of his voice and his deep connection to the blues and gospel roots that underpinned his music. Bands who had been there recounted the night with hushed reverence, almost like a spiritual experience. You could feel every word, one woman told a reporter, tears welling in her eyes. It was like he was singing just for me. A hardened veteran of many Elvis concerts admitted, "I thought it was over, but then he came out with that candle. And it was pure magic. The real Elvis." Elvis himself spent the next few days in a quiet reflection. The concert had changed him subtly but profoundly. It had reinforced what he instinctively knew, that the true magic wasn't in the lights or the costumes or the screaming crowds, but in the pure, unadulterated act of sharing music, of connecting heart to heart. He had stripped away the layers of superstardom and found the core of what he truly was, a singer, a performer, a human being who loved to connect through song. The candle itself became a symbol. The stage crew had carefully retrieved it after the show, a melted stub, and placed it in a small velvet-lined box. It was kept as a sacred relic, a reminder of the night the king had defied the darkness, with nothing but a flicker of light and the power of his voice. Over the years, the story grew into a legend. People would talk about the candlelight concert in hushed tones, a testament to Elvis's artistry and resilience. It became a powerful anecdote, embodying his genuine warmth and his profound connection to his audience. It proved that Elvis Presley was more than just a performer. He was an embodiment of music itself, capable of finding the light even when the world went dark. And in the annals of rock and roll, it stood as a truly unique, heartwarming, and utterly legendary chapter in the life of the king.